Are you drawn to another spiritual tradition despite following a specific one, but you hesitate to explore it because you feel like betraying your current path? Or do you worry that the new teaching you're interested in might confuse you and dilute your current practice? Or are you concerned about losing support from your spiritual community if you embrace another tradition in your life? Hey, my name is Christian Weilharter, and I've been practicing in the Zen tradition for over 6 years. But I've also studied and applied the teachings of Advaita Vedanta, Hinduism, Christianity, Sufism, and many other traditions. In this video, I will explore the pros and cons of mixing different spiritual traditions and discuss how ultimately there's only one path, which is the path of the heart. In the past, it was quite easy. If you were on a spiritual path, you were limited to one that was available in the area where you lived, basically. So the question about adding another tradition did not really come up for most spiritual seekers. However, as the world has become more connected over the past 100 or 200 years, things have changed radically. Knowledge about different spiritual traditions have spread across the world, and now, with the internet, things are even moving faster. It only takes a second to look up a specific teaching, and what was once hidden and kept in secret behind the doors of monasteries for thousands of years is now freely available to everyone. I think it's a great gift for humanity and awakening of consciousness, but it also brings challenges along with these changes. For example, people can feel disoriented, wondering how they can follow multiple traditions without weakening their current practice. Since there is no prescribed path on how to integrate different traditions, they are completely on their own. And this can lead to a fear of not knowing how to deal with the seeming contradictions of various doctrines. For example, in the Hindu and the Advaita traditions, the ultimate state of reality is often referred to as the self, whereas the Buddha proclaimed that there is simply no self. And if you search online, you'll find many people losing their minds about what is true and how these views can or cannot be compared. You don't even need to compare different traditions to find discussions like these. Take Zen Buddhism, for example. There has been a major discussion ongoing for at least 1,000 or 2,000 years about whether enlightenment happens suddenly or gradually. And they still have not reached a conclusion on this one yet. Or take modern interpretation of spirituality, which is often called non-duality. They reject the very notion of an individual who can or cannot attain enlightenment, saying that any seeking is ultimately useless anyway. This might seem to contradict other traditions that emphasize the importance of spiritual practice. It even seems to contradict a radical tradition, such as Zen Buddhism, where they say that there is nothing to attain, but they still emphasize the need to practice in order to realize enlightenment or nothingness. So you see, it's very easy to get caught up in the apparent differences between various teachings. It might even make you wonder if they are talking about the same thing or not. Another issue people run into is related to the current teacher and the community they practice with. They might feel disloyal to the current tradition, as if they were betraying their teachers, or they may be concerned about being judged by others in their community for exploring another teaching method. People can become very rigid when it comes to the belief system they've subscribed to. And when peers choose to embrace something else, they may criticize them for doing it. Or perhaps you start worrying about your own identity. You may have identified as, let's say, a Zen practitioner or a Christian, and perhaps you felt a sense of stability in that identity because it gave you a clear direction. Now, your identity becomes less clear, which can feel like you're losing ground, losing your stability and your sense of assurance. There are probably many more factors to consider when it comes to this. The only question we're left is, how do we handle these doubts? How can we explore another spiritual teaching we're interested in without getting lost in the apparent differences or fearing the reaction of our community? After I had become aware that something like enlightenment exists and that it's real, I wanted to know everything about it. Very quickly it became clear to me that all the sages and holy people we know about basically talked about the same thing. I learned that these people had a realization of our true nature. And depending on the country and the culture they lived in, They shared it in a way that was appropriate to that culture. They used words and concepts that reflected the culture they grew up in, but they were all pointing to the same thing. So for me, it became clear that all traditions ultimately point to the same truth, and it didn't really matter which one I followed, as long as I approached it from a genuine place. However, two spiritual traditions stood out for me. One was Hinduism and Advaita Vedanta, and the other one was Zen Buddhism. What drew me to the Indian religions was that the sages spoke very directly about spirituality and enlightenment. They have a long tradition dating back thousands of years, and I was impressed by the stories about the sages and how they attained enlightenment. And in addition to that, I also had a somewhat mysterious feeling about it. I find it hard to explain, but their entire spiritual history, the Himalayas, their music, just evoked a deep sense of sacredness within me, and the feeling that there's something really profound to discover. So I started reading books from famous Indian sages and gurus, and since it was clear to me that any tradition really points to the exact same thing, I did not limit myself to it. I started meditating based on the suggestions in these books, but I still kept doing a lot of research on the internet about enlightenment and the best way to get there. This is when I became really curious about Zen Buddhism. It seemed to me that Zen Buddhists are very serious about enlightenment. Even so serious that they don't even talk about it, since talking about enlightenment would pose a hindrance to actually realizing enlightenment. For me, they were the Navy SEALs of enlightenment. Very efficient, no bullshit, just getting the job done. So I simply looked up a Zen school near where I lived and just started attending. I began attending many of their practice sessions and also sat in many of their meditation retreats. Naturally, as I dove deeper into the Zen practice and into Zen Buddhism, I would consider this tradition the foundation of my spiritual journey. However, at no point during my time there was I exclusive to that tradition. I always continued reading books from other traditions or from teachers who did not belong to any particular tradition at all. One spiritual teacher I studied during my early phase of practicing Zen Buddhism was Jiddu Krishnamurti. He was a spiritual teacher who did not come from a specific tradition and did not teach in the style of any tradition, for he was much more radical than that. For everyone who is not familiar with his writings or speeches, he rejected any external authority, such as spiritual traditions, and emphasized the direct observation of one's own mind to achieve true freedom and insight. His teaching stuck very deeply with me and made me aware of the danger of getting too attached to a given spiritual teaching or community. So whatever teaching I encountered, I saw it merely as a different perspective of the same truth. Therefore, I would recommend not getting attached to a single point of view. See a given spiritual teaching as a means to an end, as a pointer to the truth, but don't mistake it for the truth itself. Even if the teaching is dear to your heart, remember that it is the truth you're looking for, not the teaching. And the truth is not limited to any teaching or point of view. For me, Zen is the most straightforward and direct vehicle to the truth. It leaves you with nothing but yourself, dismissing any image that you may have about yourself or the world, opening your mind to the wonder of every moment without grasping at it. Although there is a heartfelt aspect to Zen, especially in the tradition I studied, which is the Korean Zen tradition, I would say other teachings have impressed me more with their focus on the heart. One such example is Sufism. After reading the works of Irina Tweedy, a well-known Western Sufi, I couldn't help but focus my attention intensely on my heart, especially during my daily walks. So whenever I practice meditation formally, sitting on my cushion, I would employ Zen practices. But when I went for a daily walk, for example, I would keep my attention on my heart, as the Sufis suggested. I wasn't afraid of watering down any practice I did, but made time for each one that interested me and did it with my whole heart. I think it's helpful to keep different practices separate and not mix them too much to avoid diluting them. Each practice has a history of hundreds or even like thousands of years, and so I think it's important to do it in a prescribed way to get the most benefit out of it. Sure, I think there's a time and place to explore your intuition freely, perhaps even create a practice that suits your needs, allowing you to explore without being limited by any specific teaching. But again, I would ensure to set aside dedicated time for it and approach it with a clear intuition. Because in the end, we will ultimately abandon all practices altogether anyway. So the more we are rooted in truth, the more we will practice with each breath we take. So just be clear about your intention, about what you're truly longing for, and try your best to implement it in your daily life. Don't limit yourself in any rigid way, but also don't get lost in doing whatever you want to do at any given moment. Ultimately, there is no right or wrong, and sooner or later, you'll arrive at the destination you desire anyway. So everything is right just as it is, so don't doubt yourself too much. And last but not least, I want to talk about spiritual teachings and the communities and the feeling of betraying them if you add a new teaching to your life. I have met masters from different traditions, and although they were firmly rooted in their tradition, none of them declared it to be the ultimate truth. They understood that each tradition is only one path of many, and I was never discouraged to look into other traditions. They would even encourage me to just keep following my heart, but also emphasize the importance of clarity and not getting confused. I don't know what situation you might be in, but I wouldn't trust any teacher or community that sees themselves as the only chosen ones. Especially with communities, I even see the danger of people becoming attached to the comfortable feeling of belonging, of following a path together and becoming passive in their spiritual pursuit. Sure, a spiritual community is a wonderful thing, and the spirit of the group can evoke an energy that's stronger than you just practicing on your own. But many times, people are also feeling alone and seek the remedy of being in a group to overcome this feeling. If this is the intention, the practice will be shallow. There's a wonderful quote from Korean Zen master Sung-san. When alone, practice as if you are with others, and if you are with others, practice as if you are alone. So make sure your intention is clear when practicing in a community, because this is a helpful thing. Maybe even ask yourself from time to time, why are you actually practicing in a community? Because oftentimes the habit takes over and we repeat things simply because we think we need to, not because our heart truly longs for it. So lastly, I would like to comment on the concept of spiritual window shopping. There's a saying that it's better to dig one deep hole in search of water rather than hundreds of shallow holes. Since gaining access to a variety of spiritual teachings has become so easy, it can pose the danger of not committing sufficiently to one particular practice. Don't look for another teaching when it gets challenging. Allow yourself and give yourself the time to explore a tradition before moving on or adding another tradition. Our modern minds have become so restless that committing to certain things has become so much more challenging than it was 100 years ago. So keep this in mind and make sure that you don't get sidetracked by the excitement of something new instead of following through on what you initially set out to. There are many stories about ancient Zen masters who meditated on a single phrase or statement for decades before they attained enlightenment. They succeeded because they committed fully to their practice with their entire life and heart. So any true spiritual teaching will suffice if you just commit to it fully. And to summarize it, I would suggest the following. Have clarity on why you are on a spiritual journey. Have a clear intention for each practice or tradition you follow. Don't get caught up with the differences in each practice. Most often they are pointing to the same thing, but using a different explanation. A community that encourages you to follow your own wisdom and heart is helpful. And don't get lost in spiritual window shopping. If in doubt, commit fully to one tradition instead of seeking other teachings as soon as challenges arise. Don't get attached to any spiritual teaching as they merely point us to the truth, but not the truth itself. And so yeah, that's it. If this was helpful, make sure to subscribe to my free newsletter. The link is in the description. And please don't hesitate to reach out if you have a question. Your friend of the way, all the best.